There is a house in the woods they say no man should enter. But it wasn't built for men. It was built for control, for silence, for sacrifice. And you were never meant to know what happened there. The forests of Maine still whisper of them. Long after the stone walls of the Convent of Eternal Tears were reclaimed by moss and time, the land itself seems reluctant to forget. Even now, hikers report strange echoes in the pines, an unnatural stillness near the old Ashford site. The birds stop singing. The air turns heavy. And in that silence, if you listen closely, you may hear the faint weeping of those who never escaped. This isn't folklore. This is a truth that has been buried beneath generations of denial and clerical sealing. Tonight, we're not just telling you a story, we're handing you a key to a door they never wanted opened. The Ashford enigma begins with 3 women who didn't belong in America. That much is clear. They didn't speak like Americans. They didn't act like nuns. And they didn't build their institution to heal anyone. They built it to contain, to extract, to convert something pure into something profitable, usable, broken. On the surface, the convent appeared to be a religious sanctuary offering spiritual correction for troubled women. But in its hidden corridors, it operated more like a private correctional facility with experimental undertones, an unholy crossbreed of religious penitence, scientific ambition, and aristocratic cruelty. The numbers speak for themselves. Over 600 women entered that place. Fewer than half were ever seen again. Why didn't anyone stop it? That's the real question. And the answer lies not in some faraway cult or deranged fanaticism. No, the answer is more unsettling than that. The Ashford women were not rogue actors. They were plugged in, politically protected, financially connected, and intellectually endorsed by the rising medical elite of the time. They were pioneers in what you might now call behavioral modification. But in 1800, there was no polite term for what they were doing. It was psychological warfare. And women were the proving ground. What if I told you that everything you've been taught about moral institutions, religious charity, and even early American medicine was shaped, molded by experiments like this one? That somewhere between faith and science, a darker doctrine took root, one that learned how to disguise obedience as healing, one that used the female body as a lab, not to cure, but to study control. The Convent of Eternal Tears didn't just kill bodies, it erased minds. And it did so with the full blessing of American society. The Ashfords knew what they were doing. They were well-educated, multilingual, and frighteningly composed. They didn't arrive in Millbridge like refugees. They arrived like architects, like engineers of belief. Their documents were forged with such precision that even British consuls praised their lineage. The money they used to buy land wasn't just gold. It was gold that carried the seal of foreign banks with ties to Masonic networks in Europe. These women didn't flee persecution. They exported it. And when they built their stone sanctum, every brick was placed with intention. But the most disturbing element wasn't the architecture or the silence. It was the type of women they accepted. At first glance, it seemed like a pattern of moral reform. But look closer, and a different trend emerges. The convent took in women who defied structure, intellectuals, dreamers, rebels. Any woman who challenged patriarchy, theology, or the creeping industrial doctrine of the time became a candidate for treatment. They were not healed, they were silenced. And some were simply removed from history altogether. You see, the Ashford women weren't alone in their mission. They were part of a wider, shadowed movement that spread through the American Northeast in the early 1800s. A movement that saw the coming century of mechanization and needed to clear the way. Women, in particular, posed a threat. Not because they were weak, but because they were beginning to speak, to write, to resist. The convent offered a solution. Take the outspoken and rewire them under the mask of moral salvation. Let the public think it's charity. Let the families believe its treatment. But behind those stone walls, begin the extraction. Ask yourself how. Many correctional institutions were quietly doing the same thing. How many women were removed from public life under the guise of health, when in truth they were being reshaped, reprogrammed, or simply disposed of? The answer is not hundreds, it is thousands, across states, across decades. This wasn't a tragedy, it was a template. Tonight, we are descending into one of the first blueprints of institutional mind control in American history. But we're not stopping at the Ashford family, because their practices didn't end when their building collapsed. Their techniques evolved, merged, dispersed into elite universities, covert psychiatric units, and even early intelligence programs. The house may be gone, but the method survives. This isn't folklore, this is design. And once you begin to see the pattern, you'll understand obedience isn't asked for. It's manufactured. And it started here, with the house that killed them. Stay with me. In Section 2, we begin to unlock the core ritual that powered the Ashford system, and the elite bloodline behind it. They called it the quieting, but it wasn't. Quiet. Beneath the convent's stone floors, beyond the chapel, there existed a substructure that was never listed in any public records. Survivors, what few there were, described it only in fragments, like men recalling a fire after smoke inhalation. The quieting chamber, as it came to be known, was not a place of punishment. It was a place of transformation, and not the kind offered by religion. This was surgical, psychological, and permanent. When a woman was brought to the quieting, she wasn't dragged. She was escorted, clothed in white, stripped of her name, and given a number. The nuns spoke in a language that resembled Latin, but those who studied the few phrases recovered insist it was older Proto-Germanic, or possibly something Phoenician. It wasn't just ritual, it was code. A script designed to disorient the subject, confuse their temporal sense, and separate the self from identity. Everything in that room was calculated. Temperature, scent, even the vibration of the floor. Some survivors claimed it pulsed like a heartbeat. Others described an audible hum that induced nausea, disassociation, or uncontrollable sobbing. You may ask, how could 3 women develop such complex psychological mechanisms in the wilderness of Maine in 1798? Because they weren't alone. The Ashford lineage traces back to 13th century Bavaria. The family was excommunicated by the church under accusations of necromantic experimentation, specifically the manipulation of will through sound and shadow. But they weren't destroyed, they adapted. They rebranded their work as spiritual reformation and moved through aristocratic circles in England, France, and Prussia, leaving a trail of vanished housemaids, hysterical daughters, and widows labeled insane. Every few decades, they'd vanish, only to resurface under new names in new territories, always near power. Always near institutions. In America, they found their opportunity. The post-revolution chaos, the religious tolerance, the frontier. Lawlessness, all perfect soil for planting the next phase of their work. The Ashfords weren't simply torturing women. They were studying obedience, mapping the soul. They believed the human psyche could be reshaped, entirely broken down like language, and rebuilt to speak only what they allowed, and they succeeded. Testimonies, hidden for over a century, describe the returnees women who came back from the convent. Not healed, but hollow. They smiled without cause. Their speech was stilted. They followed instructions without question, even dangerous ones. Some were completely mute. One woman, Abigail Norrington, was institutionalized just 6 weeks after returning home. Her father noted in his diary that she didn't recognize her mother, but sang hymns perfectly, on command for hours. Another survivor, Eleanor White, attempted to smother her newborn within days of release, claiming the child was unblessed and still carrying the imprint. The language these women used was bizarre combinations of religious terminology, mathematical phrases, and anatomical references. One priest who tried to perform an exorcism on a survivor wrote, "What I saw was not possession. It was programming." These weren't cases of trauma. They were the byproducts of systematic psychological engineering. The Ashfords called it healing. But what they were doing was rewriting humanity. And here's the part they don't want you to know. This wasn't buried because it was shameful. It was buried because it was useful. After the convent was exposed in 1834 under murky accusations of abuse and several unexplained deaths, the documents seized from the premises were not destroyed. They were archived, first by the local sheriff, then transferred to Boston, and eventually, after several strange disappearances, found their way to a private research group affiliated with Harvard's early psychology department. Names like Cabot, Lowell, and Wadsworth appear in the donation ledgers, families tied to modern think tanks, behavioral research groups, and yes, even the intelligence community. What does this mean? It means what happened in that house wasn't forgotten. It was studied, refined, turned into models of correctional education, institutional therapy, and later black site behavioral modification programs during the Cold War. MKUltra didn't begin with the CIA. It began in places like the Ashford house. The same tactics, the same goals. Break the will. Rebuild the mind. Maintain control. You've heard whispers of this before, stories of orphanages that bred silence, sanitariums where patients disappeared, private schools with untraceable punishments. But they all stem from the same root. The idea that behavior can be engineered, not through freedom, but through trauma, repetition, and selective reward. The Ashfords just happened to be the first to write it down. Think about that. The entire system you trust, medicine, psychology, education, it's built atop test subjects who were never allowed to scream, who were told their suffering was salvation, who were made into examples of correction. And we praised it. The convent of eternal tears was not shut down because the public demanded justice. It was shut down because the experiment had concluded. The data was collected, the protocols had evolved, and the Ashford line? It didn't die out, it scattered. Moved into law, medicine, academia. You've probably seen them. The same silver eyes, the same composure, the same power cloaked in philanthropy. We are not just talking about a forgotten house in the woods. We're talking about the origin of obedience as a science. And here's where you come in, if you've felt it deep in your gut that something in this world doesn't add up. That everything from how you learn to how you grieve feels manufactured. You're not alone. You're waking up. Comment the phrase, "I reclaim the quiet," twice below. Not just to show the algorithm that you see, but to anchor yourself to what's coming next, because the descent is just beginning. In Section 3, we'll unmask the priesthood behind the Ashford enigma and reveal how their ideology shaped an entire generation of American institutions. The further you go, the colder it gets, because at the heart of the Ashford enigma isn't just cruelty. It's structure. And structure is far more terrifying than madness. Madness is chaotic, desperate, emotional. But structure is cold, mathematical, repeatable. And the Ashfords didn't act alone. Behind them stood a network, cloaked, not in shadows but in robes, pulpits, and college lecture halls. A hidden priesthood of ideology that provided the moral scaffolding for their most unholy work. Let me ask you something. What if the church wasn't the mask, but the delivery system? In 1801, 2 years after the convent opened, the Ashfords received a visitor, a man named Father Elias Rennick. On paper, he was an Anglican missionary dispatched to the frontier to monitor new religious developments. But Rennick's name doesn't appear in any Anglican archives. No birth certificate, no theological education, no immigration record. What does exist, however, are coded correspondences found in the Wadsworth estate, dated decades later, that reference a brother Rennick under the title custodian of the fifth gate. What that means, no one fully knows, but the context suggests ritual oversight, possibly in relation to early American esoteric orders. Rennick's arrival marked a dramatic shift in the convent's operations. Before him, the Ashfords had treated women in isolation, one by one, but after his appearance, the penitents were grouped, subjected to synchronized rituals, sleep deprivation, mirror work, prolonged fasting combined with scripted confession, and silent response conditioning. Rennick brought with him a ledger written in an unknown cipher. The few decoded pages reference experiments in cognitive dissociation through sacramental inversion. That means he was testing what would later be called psychic splitting, inducing spiritual disorientation by corrupting the familiar. One ritual required women to repeat traditional prayers backward while staring into polished obsidian. Another had them write their confessions with their non-dominant hand, naked, while surrounded by silent witnesses in black veils. The intent wasn't penance, it was destabilization. These weren't rituals of faith. They were protocols of control. Rennick reported to no known bishop. He arrived with no entourage. And yet, every 3 months, a courier would arrive from Boston carrying thick envelopes and sealed packages, some bearing the crest of the Massachusetts Historical Society, others labeled Harvard Private Archives. This wasn't a rogue priest. This was an agent of something larger. Look closely, and you'll find this pattern across the early republic. Religious institutions functioning as psychological labs. Episcopal retreats that quietly erased non-conforming daughters. Jesuit academies whose records include sudden mental breakdowns among first-year female students. And always those shadowy figures who moved between pulpits and universities with no clear origin. They called themselves custodians, but what they were really doing was curating minds. The Ashford convent was just one node in a larger map of ideological experimentation. And its central theme? Submission through confusion. They believed that the human spirit could be cracked not through violence, but through ritual contradiction. Tell a girl she is holy, then punish her for thinking. Preach salvation, then cage her in darkness. Praise her obedience, then erase her name. Over time, the subject begins to doubt her very self, not just her memory, but her existence. And that's when the rewriting begins. It's what modern intelligence agencies would later call identity fracture. Break the mirror, then guide her in rebuilding it, with you holding the glue. By 1805, the convent was hosting private retreats for elite families. Prominent merchants from Boston, judges from Massachusetts Bay, even a young state senator whose family crest would later be found etched into the chapel's cornerstone. These weren't just penitents. These were observers, donors, apprentices, men with power, eager to learn how to keep it. That's when the experiments escalated. There are letters buried for decades, only uncovered in a private estate sale. In 1978, that detail, Phase 4 Rebirth, a procedure requiring the subject to remain blindfolded for 9 days, while subjected to alternating voices of praise and condemnation. At the end of this process, the woman was given a new name, a new religion, and often a new accent. Survivors of this phase showed permanent neurological changes, disrupted circadian rhythms, selective mutism, and complete loss of original language skills. One chilling testimony, transcribed by an anonymous benefactor in 1820, reads, "She spoke only in numbers. When I asked her name, she whispered 13-4-9-0. Single quotes. When I pressed her, she began bleeding from the nose. It was as if someone had booby-trapped her mind. That's not mental illness. That's deliberate neural engineering. And remember, this wasn't done in some remote European dungeon. It was done in the early American Northeast, under the blessing of Christian charity and with the quiet approval of intellectual elites. Think about what that means. It means the very institutions we associate with healing and knowledge were, from their inception, tools of transformation. But not the kind that uplifts, the kind that mutates, that subdues, that prepares a generation to obey without knowing why. And if you think this was only happening to women, think again. While the Ashford convent specialized in female correction, parallel institutions emerged across the colonies, experimenting on boys, especially orphans, Native American children, and the sons of immigrants. They called it assimilation. They said it was education. But beneath it all was the same goal. Erase the wild. Replace it with obedience. You've seen the remnants. The schools where no one asks why so many students went missing. The churches that quietly settled cases of discipline gone too far. The labs funded by families with long-forgotten ties to the Ashford line. It's all connected. This wasn't a period of darkness. It was the blueprint for modern light. A light so sterile, so curated, that you forgot it casts no shadow dot until now dot in Section 4. We will dive into the bloodline that funded this machine, the forgotten heirs of Ashford, and trace their silent ascent into positions of authority you still obey today. Without knowing why blood remembers. That's the first truth the Ashford women etched into their hidden manuscripts, documents later found bound in calfskin, locked in iron chests buried beneath the foundation of the convent's chapel. In one of the texts, Agatha Ashford writes in her unnerving precision, "What we build with obedience must be passed down through blood, or it will rot from within." That sentence was repeated again and again, in ink, in carving, and in song. Because the Ashford legacy was never about 3 women. It was about succession. And that succession didn't end when the convent burned. Let's follow the money. After the 1834 scandal, most believed the Ashford family had vanished. In truth, the names changed, but the blood didn't. The estate, long believed to be seized by the state, was quietly transferred to a New England shipping firm, Winthrop and Hensley, based in Boston. A curious connection until you realize that the firm's founder, Elias Hensley, was married to Beatrice Ashford, Agatha's niece, who had conveniently disavowed the convent before its collapse. But Beatrice didn't disappear. She simply entered society under a new guise, as the benefactor of charitable orphanages, reform schools, and girls' academies across Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Each institution received anonymous funding, always in the form of bearer bonds, property deeds, and sealed donations from continental patrons. But if you trace the names of the school heads, matrons, and chaplains, you'll find something chilling. They all passed through a small seminary in Sussex, England, known as the Temple of St. Agnes the Seer, a private, invitation-only clergy school funded by the British Society for Neurological Research. Do you see it? The Ashford family didn't vanish. They dispersed. Like a virus that adapts after exposure, they changed names, professions, and locations, but their mission stayed intact. Their bloodline intermarried with the Cabots, the Van Rensselaers, the Gardners, and even the Sloan family, whose heirs helped found early psychiatric wings in Boston's General Hospital. These weren't just social alliances. They were calculated mergers, and every few decades, a new program would emerge, always under the banner of care, reform, or enlightenment. But beneath it, always the same core: control through conversion. Let's get specific. In 1891, the Sloan Ashford Fund was established for the improvement of moral education among wayward girls. One of its pilot schools was St. Ruth's House of Gentle Reform in New Haven. On the surface, it taught etiquette, posture, and domestic skills. But in 1996, a renovation crew found a sub-basement sealed behind brick walls. Inside, a padded room, surgical tools dated to 1903, and journals detailing experiments in will realignment through sensory deprivation. No charges were filed. Why? Because the Board of Trustees for St. Ruth's included a U.S. Senator, 2 Yale professors, and a direct descendant of Elias Hensley, the same man who saved the Ashford fortune. Let's go deeper. In the 1940s, as the world turned to war and nations scrambled for dominance, a new frontier emerged: psychological warfare. Intelligence agencies, British and American, began searching for methods to break minds without breaking bodies. And suddenly, the same surnames reappeared: Hensley, Cabot, Ashford. This time not as abbesses or clergy, but as donors, trustees, and consultants. Guess who funded several early CIA research grants into hypnosis, amnesia induction, and trauma-based programming? The Ashford Trust of Philadelphia, operating under the innocuous name the Carlyle Group for Cognitive Advancement. Founded in 1939, its mission statement reads, "To research and advance the reformation of human will toward communal alignment." And it's still active today. Their alumni now include defense contractors, media executives, and behavioral science leaders at major U.S. universities. What started in a basement in Maine is now embedded in the digital policies that shape your online behavior, in the HR scripts that dictate what you're allowed to say, in the school curriculums that emphasize conformity over thought. The house that killed, then didn't die. It went public. It learned to wear a smile, a diploma, a logo. But behind every institution that praises submission, that punishes deviance, that pathologizes dissent, you'll find the remnants of the Ashford design. Still don't believe it? Go search your town's oldest reform school. Look into its founders. Look for those crests, those surnames, those odd gaps in archived records. They're there, because the bloodline never severed. It multiplied. But here's what they don't expect: that you're listening now, that you're beginning to trace the map not just of history, but of yourself. That you're asking, what parts of me were shaped by this system? What parts of my silence, my shame, my hesitation were never truly mine? And that question, once asked, cannot be unasked. Because the bloodline can only survive if you forget. You were never meant to remember. You were never meant to speak. And now that you are, they will hear it. In Section 5, we dive into the present, how these ancient systems evolved into digital manipulation, how your devices echo the very rituals of Ashford conditioning, and why the final frontier of control is not your body but your attention. They've entered your home without knocking. Not through brute force, not with armies or invasions, but with light, screens, notifications, and silence. This is how they do it now, not in stone chambers or convent basements, but through the interface you touch every day, the device you cradle at night, the voice that responds when you speak, but never truly answers. The world has traded iron chains for algorithms. And yet, the goal remains unchanged: compliance through confusion, obedience through saturation, consent through repetition. What began with chance in a cold cellar has evolved into behavioral loops coded into your daily life. And the architects? Still here, still watching. Let's unpack this. In 2013, a little-known firm known as Kinesis Global Strategies partnered with several major tech conglomerates to fund a study called Project Selim. On the surface, it was presented as an initiative to explore digital cognition patterns in young adults. But if you dig into its structure, a disturbing pattern emerges. Half the fund's trustees were descended from early American families linked to the Ashford bloodline: Cabot, Wadsworth, Hensley, and a resurrected Ashford holding company, now hidden behind a maze of shell corporations. The research wasn't about helping people. It was about replicating the Ashford method digitally. Here's how it works. First, you overload constant updates, opinions, pseudo-conflicts, and fear-based headlines. Just like the chants of contradictory doctrine in the quieting room, this modern noise fractures internal thought. It disables reflection. Then comes the gaze tracking, the predictive modeling, the feed curation. The same mirroring techniques used in the convent, where women were surrounded by silent reflections, forced to confront distorted versions of themselves, now occur on every scroll. You see what they want you to see. Feel what they want you to feel. Think you're choosing. But you're not. You're reacting, just like they trained the penitents to do. Behaviorist B.F. Skinner once said, "The real question is not whether machines think, but whether men do." But that question was answered long ago by the Ashfords. They proved that if you bombard a soul long enough, if you shape the room, the air, the reward, the punishment, and the silence, a person will choose the path laid before them and believe. It was their idea. Now, they don't need nuns. They don't need candles. They don't need cells. They have your feed. They have the data. And most importantly, they have your attention. Because that's the final frontier. Not your money. Not your vote. Not even your body. Your attention is what they want. Because where your attention goes, so goes your will. You may think you're immune. You may laugh it off. I don't fall for trends. I'm not weak. But tell me this. How often do you check your phone when you feel lost? When you're alone? When you want reassurance or meaning? That's not convenience. That's conditioning. The same way women in the convent began to crave correction, not because they liked it, but because they were trained to associate silence with danger and structure with safety. You are being trained. And the same bloodline that built the Ashford system has spent centuries refining this practice until you no longer need to be touched, shackled, or even told what to do. Because now you do it to yourself. Don't believe me? Look at engagement cycles. Every app, every notification, every streak is a ritual, an invisible rosary. They reward the compliant. They silence the non-participant. Algorithms have no morality. They only serve the masters who feed them. And those masters have names you no longer recognize, but bloodlines you now do. Remember the custodians I told you about? The ones who guided rituals from behind the curtain? They never left. Today they sit on boards of behavioral research labs. They consult on interface psychology. They write policies on what content is harmful, what speech is dangerous, what questions are unhealthy. They've weaponized care. And if you resist, if you question too loudly, you're labeled conspiracist, unstable, antisocial. Just like the women sent to the convent. You don't need a dungeon. All you need is social isolation, a frozen bank account, a shadow ban. We've just digitized the convent. But here's what they fear: awareness. Because once you see the system, it loses its grip. They rely on your blindness, on your fatigue, on your addiction to comfort. But you're still here, listening, watching, asking. And that's dangerous. That's lethal to the machine. You want proof? Search your local school district's behavioral curriculum. Trace the donors. Find out who funds their emotional guidance systems. Look into the AI companies shaping education. You'll see the same patterns, the same phrases, the same symbols carved into the Ashford stones, now embedded in logos and grant names. It never stopped. It just upgraded, but so can you. If you've made it this far, you're no longer just a viewer, you're a witness. Comment: I reclaim the quiet. Again. Once for your mind. Once for your attention. Because silence is no longer absence. Silence is your line in the sand. In Section 6, we descend even deeper into the ritual architecture of the Ashford legacy and how those ancient blueprints now shape modern cities, schools, and digital spaces in ways you were never supposed to notice. Look around your city. The tallest building, the oldest library, the courthouse with the bronze eagle. Notice the layout, the symmetry, the deliberate voids and clusters. You thought it was just urban planning, just concrete and zoning, until you understand this. Are walking through a ritual, and the architects didn't design for efficiency. They designed for control. This section will take us into the ritual architecture, born from the Ashford bloodline structures, built not just with stone, but with silence, intent, and sacrifice. These aren't just buildings, they're amplifiers. And what they amplify isn't sound. It's behavioral energy. Let's begin with the Ashford Cathedral, completed in 1832. Hidden beneath the public sanctuary, there exists a chamber of concentric circles, one entrance, no exits, and 7 niches carved in the shape of kneeling silhouettes. It was called the echo chamber. Whispers spoken within the center amplified and echoed unnaturally, making it impossible for one to distinguish whether the voices are theirs or someone else's. It was used for penitents who resisted spiritual conditioning until they cracked under the acoustic weight of confusion. But here's what's worse. This exact chamber design was patented in 1994 under the name Reflex Vault, a so-called immersive meditation architecture that now exists beneath 17 corporate campuses, including 2 in Silicon Valley, 1 in Toronto, and another under a certain eco-spiritual retreat in the Swiss Alps. Coincidence? No, the Ashford method. Lives on through buildings that induce specific mental states. Let's break it down. Ancient sacred geometry circles. Crosses, golden ratios wasn't just symbolic. It was psychological. The Ashfords funded early American urban planners to embed this geometry into city grids. Look at Washington, D.C., look at Philadelphia. Now overlay those with maps of ancient convent blueprints from Bordeaux, Dublin, or Bavaria. The alignment of key power centers, courts, temples, museums matches the layout of the original 7-fold penitence garden, a lost structure tied to Ashford mysticism. And then there's the obelisk principle used in over 67 capital cities globally. These stone monoliths don't serve structural purposes. But according to declassified Vatican architectural memos, they were originally placed at key acoustic convergence points, where energy, emotional, spiritual, collective accumulates and resonates. In Ashford lore, these points were called tolling grounds, locations where the cries of the unwilling initiates would echo eternally unless rituals of silence were performed. Now think, why are so many schools, courthouses, and civic centers designed with long halls, high ceilings, echo chambers? Because they induce vulnerability. They shrink your voice. They make you feel small. They recreate the same architecture of submission once used in Ashford convents, where defiant girls were paraded down the hall of witnesses, their footsteps magnified tenfold to amplify shame. You still walk these halls today. And that's just physical space. Now let's talk digital architecture. Ever noticed how certain apps never let you pause without guilt? How Infinite Scroll was designed to mimic the corridor effect, a psychological loop discovered in the Ashford quieting room, where nuns would walk endlessly between mirrors until time lost meaning. Modern UX designers admit they study loop reinforcement behavior, but they don't tell you the source. That it comes from a monastic system built to erase dissent, not boost productivity. That's why most meditation apps don't free you, they funnel you. Same circles, same ambient chants, same ritual architecture. Digital now, but still prison. Still Ashford. Now, here's the real twist. The Ashford Foundation for Ritual Architecture never disbanded. It just rebranded in 1987 as the Center for Cognitive Space Optimization, and today, it consults for over 70% of U.S. school systems, hospital design firms, and wellness spaces. These aren't just buildings. They are interfaces for consent, the kind of consent that makes you feel calm while your will is being gently bent, the same way penitents were trained to smile when they were finally broken. This isn't just theory. There's a reason why when tragedy strikes, people gather around courthouses and cathedrals. Not because they're sacred, but because, on some subconscious level, the architecture commands silence, awe, submission. Rituals don't need incense anymore. They just need lines, glass, screens, geometry. And you walk through them every day, thinking you're free, but you're not. You're contained. Still with me? In Section 7, we turn to the silencing protocols, the forbidden psychological methods Ashford operatives used to erase not just rebellion, but memory, and how these same techniques now influence public mental health policy, education, and even your own thought patterns. And the scariest part? You probably use some of them on yourself. You ever wonder why you forget the most important things? Not just birthdays or passwords, but truths. Deep, personal truths, like how your childhood actually felt. The way you used to cry in a corner and didn't know why. Or the exact moment you stopped trusting your own instincts. You didn't just forget. You were taught to forget. This is the legacy of the Ashford Order's silencing protocols. A system so refined, so surgical, that it could not only erase defiance, but remove memory without drugs, violence, or visible coercion. A system exported quietly to public institutions, religious seminaries, and later, digital learning platforms. Disguised as therapy. It began in 1811. The Ashfords were facing internal collapse. Dozens of girls from the convent had begun resisting. Not running, not screaming, but remembering. Remembering the hidden rites, the punishments, the chambers that weren't supposed to exist. Some even began writing diaries, symbols, paintings. The order panicked. If memory could not be extinguished through fear, it would have to be erased from the inside out. Enter Sister Emilienne, a defrocked neurotheologian from the Montpellier Institute. Her method? Layered isolation. Here's how it worked. The subject was placed in a ritual loop of repetitive tasks: folding cloth, tracing lines, reciting mantras, but with intentional interruptions. At random intervals, a bell would chime, a flash would occur, a phrase would whisper through hidden ducts. This is not your thought. Over time, the girl no longer trusted her own internal monologue. Her inner voice became alien. Once doubt took root, the next phase began: emotive decoupling. Any memory associated with emotional intensity, pain, joy, rage, was gently stripped of context. Instead of recalling her mother's face or a punishment, the girl would simply feel a vague unease with no anchor. Detached, suspended, obedient. Sound familiar? Now look at how modern education systems manage students with trauma. Behavior modification, attention redirection, scripted emotional labels, not healing. Fragmenting, dislocating the source from the self. But it doesn't end there. In 1974, a secret Ashford offshoot, known as the Lucerna Group, ran parallel programs within state-funded psychiatric clinics. Patients, many of them children, were subjected to experimental therapies involving white noise, narrative disruption, and identity flooding. The goal wasn't to heal schizophrenia or PTSD. It was to discover how far the mind could be pushed into rewriting itself voluntarily. Documents from the Greystone Archive, leaked in 2011, confirmed that over 3,000 patients had memories implanted, false recollections of abuse, dreams, even entire childhoods. Many never recovered. The project was shelved publicly, but resurfaced under the name Narrative Correction Protocols, NCP, used now in private rehabilitation facilities, digital therapy apps, and even virtual reality grief simulators. And now it's in you. Every time your phone suggests what you might be feeling. Every time your app tells you how to let go of thoughts you haven't even processed. Every time a trauma is repackaged as a learning moment before you've even bled. You're not healing. You're being rewired. You see, Ashford doctrine didn't believe in silence as absence. They believed in engineered forgetting. A silence so deep, it erased the soul's ability to remember who it used to be. And this is the horror no one wants to admit. Some of the voices in your head are not yours. Some of your memories aren't missing. They were muted. The laugh you know, longer remembered. The fear that doesn't match the story, The dream you stopped telling because it always made your stomach turn, though no one else ever said it was wrong. Ashford methods live on in digital therapeutics, in trauma workshops funded by foundations that trace back to the very institutions that created the harm. It's why you feel empty after some therapy. Why? Certain self-help books leave you feeling quietly ashamed, because the modern healing industry was built not to restore, but to flatten, to file away jagged truth and reshape the survivor into a manageable unit. They don't want you to remember who hurt you. They want you to forget that you ever resisted. And if that doesn't terrify you yet, wait until Section 8, because in the next part, we descend into the blood doctrine, the genetic tracing program that revealed certain bloodlines were not just shaped by trauma, but designed to carry it, generation after generation, like a virus. And the elite? They've been tracking these carriers for centuries, even marrying them, even breeding them, because once you find the right vessel, you never let it go. What if I told you pain can be inherited? Not just genetically, but ritually, strategically engineered across bloodlines like a dark inheritance passed through wombs, contracts, and graves. This is not metaphor. This is the Ashford blood doctrine, the most closely guarded secret of the order. And it's why certain families, certain names, and certain types of suffering always reappear in history with eerie precision. It began with the discovery of the Moorfield Index, a handwritten codex buried in the stone foundations of Ashford's northern crypts. Dated 1613. It contained over 900 surnames, each linked not to wealth or land, but to specific emotional resonances. Some lines carried high levels of what the order called divine receptivity, an ancient term for what modern psychology calls trauma sensitivity. These weren't just victims, they were conductors of agony. And to the order, they were valuable. Not because they could be healed, but because they could retain pain without breaking. One such bloodline was the Harrowells, an old Irish family line that suffered 5 suicides, 3 famines, and dozens of institutionalizations across only 3 generations. The order embedded them into convents, orphanages, and military intelligence sectors because their grief responses created predictable, controllable behavior under extreme pressure. Another example, the Vellums, whose women consistently birthed children with high emotional mimicry, ideal candidates for infiltration, espionage, and martyr. Making. By the 1800s, the Ashfords had partnered with eugenics philosophers under the guise of theological study. Their goal? To track bloodlines not by nobility, but by psychic yield, the ability to host visions, submit to authority, or fracture in ways that produced obedience rather than rebellion. Pain wasn't a side effect. Pain was the product. Enter the Crimson Ledger Project of 1872, a covert operation to catalog soul containers, children born to mothers from targeted lineages. These children were observed from birth. Most were never told who their real families were. Some were swapped at birth. Some were adopted by Ashford affiliates posing as caretakers, pastors, or healers. In these households, the children were subjected to ritualized exposures, traumas, disguised as divine tests, designed to shape their neurological pathways for future submission. And it didn't end with the Ashfords. In the 20th century, remnants of the blood doctrine fed directly into Operation Monarch, a real CIA black project focused on trauma-based mind control. Many of the test subjects came from disturbingly similar backgrounds: generational abuse, religious schooling, sudden adoptions. Coincidence? Or was the Ashford Index used as a source file? Here's the most disturbing part. In 2004, a confidential Vatican memo later leaked through the Dismas papers confirmed the Church's access to a legacy map detailing bloodlines suitable for divine instrumentation. It listed families across France, Argentina, the US, and parts of Eastern Europe. Some were ordinary citizens. Others were famous. A few were dead. But dozens were children. Still alive, Still monitored. Still being prepared. Because in Ashford theology, redemption was never the point. Containment was. And if your family ever felt curse, ever had repeated patterns of unexplained tragedy, addiction, lost time, or inexplicable guilt, you may not be cursed. You may have been chosen, a vessel, in a legacy you never consented to. And the most chilling question of all, are you still yourself? Or are you a container for a pain not your own? In Section 9, we confront the mirror trials, the final and most devastating phase of the Ashford indoctrination process. A psychological mechanism so powerful, it caused subjects to confuse their abusers with themselves. Once that happens, you don't need chains. You'll police yourself forever. Have you ever looked in the mirror and felt like you were staring at a stranger? Not because your face had changed, but because something inside had been hollowed out, switched. That disorientation, that creeping sense that your own reflection is lying to you, that's not madness. That's conditioning. And it's exactly what the Ashfords perfected in their final weapon, the mirror trials. This was no metaphor, no philosophy. It was a structured, repeatable, psychological assault designed to fracture the boundary between victim and perpetrator. First implemented in 1828 in the underground chambers of Ashford Southern, a state known cryptically as the Chapel of Confluence, the mirror trials were administered to those who had already survived other phases of indoctrination, survivors, fighters, the ones who still showed signs of resistance. So how do you break someone who refuses to break? You teach them that the wound is their fault. The ritual began with sensory deprivation. Subjects, mostly girls aged 11 to 17, were kept in perfect silence and darkness for days. Then, on the fourth night, they were led blindfolded into a candlelit chamber where a tall mirror stood against the far wall. They were made to sit directly in front of it, naked, alone. A voice concealed through echoing ducts began asking questions, not ordinary questions, questions designed to reassign guilt. Why did you let it happen? Why did he choose you? What part of you wanted it? You see where this is going. If a subject began to cry, or scream, or protest, the mirror would be rotated, and behind it was a second girl. Not a stranger, but another initiate, often someone the subject had bonded with. That girl was mimicking her exact posture, expression, and voice through hours of conditioning and rehearsal. Suddenly, the subject wasn't looking at herself anymore. She was looking at someone pretending to be her. The effect? Disintegration. She began to question whether her memories were hers at all, or if she had absorbed someone else's pain. This is the core of the mirror trials, forced empathic inversion. Victims were made to see themselves as monsters. And once that seed was planted, it grew like rot. Modern psychologists call it internalized perpetration syndrome, a rare trauma response where survivors begin unconsciously mimicking the behavioral patterns of their abuser, not out of admiration, but out of warped identity collapse. But the Ashfords, they designed it. They triggered it on purpose that later versions of the mirror trials found their way into 20th century rehabilitation camps, wartime POW programs, and perhaps most chillingly some early corporate HR reformation. Models used on whistleblowers and trauma disclosure cases. If that sounds absurd, check the patents. One, from 1992, describes a two-subject reflective behavioral correction chamber, complete with mirrored feedback loops, scripted confrontations, and reward-based guilt modulation. You thought this ended in the past? Think again. Today, it's digital. You're told to take accountability for your trauma. You're told your healing is blocked because you aren't trying hard enough, that you need to own your part. Meanwhile, systems of abuse remain untouched because your gaze has been turned inward. Congratulations, you've completed your mirror trial. You're no longer a threat. You're a reflection shining with guilt, self-doubt, and performative growth. Exactly as they designed. In Section 10, We go to the place where all this began, the Moorfields Crypt, where the bones of the original Ashford founders were buried alongside a manuscript so dangerous, it was sealed behind a wall of bloodied sandstone. They called it the grafting text, because there they stopped just torturing souls and began fusing them. Deep beneath the windswept heaths of Northumberland lies the final resting place of the founding Ashfords, not in honor, but in secrecy. Sealed behind carved obsidian doors and a 6-lock iron gate lies the Moorfields Crypt, a structure unmarked on maps, protected by folklore, and whispered about only in forgotten diocesan records. But the deeper horror is not in the bones beneath its stone, but in what was buried with them. The grafting text, the final chapter, the forbidden manuscript that marked the Ashfords' descent from ritualists to engineers of the soul. Grafting text is no myth. Confirmed in 1951 by Vatican underground operatives during the Valdenza inquiry, the document is written in a hybrid of ancient Latin, Anglo-Saxon, and an unknown glyphic language linked to pre-Christian death cults in Carthage and Phrygia. It outlines the process not for healing trauma, nor even merely surviving it, but for extracting, transferring, and grafting one person's psychic scars onto another. This was not symbolism. This was a literal ritual protocol, a psychic surgery of sorts, using pain as a conductor. The core principle of the grafting ritual is empathic fusion through witness suffering. 2 subjects are required. 1, the root, must carry a deep, unresolved trauma. The second, the vessel, must be emotionally open, identity fractured, and linguistically suggestible. In a controlled setting, the root relives their most devastating memory, while the vessel is exposed to synchronized physical stimuli, vocal mimicking, and mirrored breath work. At the climax, a specific chant is recited, translated loosely as "divide us so we may be whole." And then it happens. Memories begin to shift. The vessel experiences dreams they never lived, phantom pains, mood swings foreign to their disposition. Meanwhile, the root reports relief, lightness, a feeling of being watched from behind their own eyes. In countless ritual notes discovered in the Ashford annotations, many roots reported hearing the same phrase whispered in their sleep: "You are no longer the bearer." The ethical implications are horrific. It means suffering can be exported, that you can offload your shame onto another human being and walk away clean. But it comes at a cost. The vessel becomes fragmented, not merely haunted, but blended. Some developed false memories. Others began speaking in languages they'd never learned. A few went completely silent, staring at mirrors for hours, their reflections blinking out of sync. And in 2008, an anonymous leak from a biotech facility in Geneva revealed something even darker: a machine called the Argus Cradle. Based on the principles of the grafting text, it used a synthetic neural bridge to transfer emotive imprints from one subject to another. On paper, it was a trauma therapy breakthrough. In practice, it created empathic slaves, vessels trained to carry pain that wasn't theirs, servants born from other people's nightmares, entire lives rearranged by borrowed agony. The order called it the Great Balancing. Justice, they said, wasn't healing the wound, but redistributing it. And so we ask the question: if your fear, your guilt, your sorrow has always felt alien, misplaced, even ancestral,